May it please the court, my name is Beatrice Su, my co-counsel is Brian Sia, and we represent the petitioners, Maria Elena and Monica Quispe. Your Excellency, this is a case about the Quispe sisters. Two young women from the indigenous community of Wami, Naira, who were only 12 and 15 when they were detained by the Special Military Base, or SMB, in control of their province. These soldiers were sent to Naira to maintain control over the area and to fight crime. But instead, for 1 month in March 1992, they took the Quispe sisters away from their homes and detained them on accusations of involvement with terrorist activities. The Quispes were never brought before any judicial authority. For 1 month, the same soldiers then brutally violated the Quispes' essential human rights by repeatedly using them first as domestic labor and then as targets for their sexual depravity. And yet, almost 3 decades after the declaration of the state of emergency, Naira has allowed these men to enjoy impunity for their actions. Your Excellency, my submissions will argue the following. Number 1, that Naira is in breach of the American Convention of Human Rights, or ACHR, obligations to the petitioners with regards to the violations committed in 1992. Number 2, Naira's declaration of a state of emergency does not excuse the aforementioned violations. My co-counsel will argue that it is this state's general duty to ensure free and full exercise of human rights to all persons. Therefore, number 1, the fact that the SMB soldiers have been protected by the lapse of a domestic limitation period is in itself a violation. And number 2, Naira's failure to prevent and investigate the domestic abuse suffered by Maria Quispe in 2014 is also a violation of the aforementioned convention. Moving to our first submission, the thesis of our first substantive point is as follows. In A, repeatedly raping and gang raping the Quispes. B, detaining the Quispes on mere suspicions of being involved in the Freedom Brigade's criminal activities. And C, forcing the Quispes to cook, clean, and do laundry in the Wami Special Military Base. During their detention, the SMB soldiers cruelly and deliberately violated the Quispes' human rights. At the material time, we want to highlight that there are 3 categories of violations, and I will be taking each category in turn.
Before you get there, is it undisputed that these actions actually took place?
Well, Your Excellency, it is not undisputed. I believe paragraph 40 does say that the state has denied that these allegations occurred. However, we have sufficient evidence to conclude
We just have the evidence of the 2 of them. Is it corroborated by any other victims who similarly suffered such abuse, or any other objective evidence to, other than this, the testimony of these 2?
Well, Your Excellency, we believe that the NGO Kilapura does have evidence from other witnesses, although we have not received instructions on what these specific pieces of evidence are.
Where is your belief?
It is in paragraph, hold on. Paragraph 33, the first sentence reads, after conducting a thorough investigation, they included interviews with neighbours, victims, and witnesses, which leads us to conclude there must necessarily be other witnesses to the allegations as well.
So there are 3 violations, right?
Yes, Your Excellency. If you'd like me to go through them again, or...
No, just briefly summarize the 3.
Okay. The first submission that we want to discuss would be the repeated rape and gang rape of the Quispes, which we believe to be a violation of their right to the freedom from torture under Article 5.2. Under Article 27.2, this right is non-derogable.
27.2.
Okay. While Article 5 consists several gradations and embraces treatment ranging from torture to cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishment, the petitioners submit that the rape and gang rape in question constitutes torture because the repeated assaults were number 1, intentional acts, number 2, they caused the Quispes severe physical and mental suffering, and number 3, they were committed with the purpose of intimidating, punishing, and interrogating the Quispes, whom the soldiers believe were accomplices to the terrorist group, the Freedom Brigade.
I have difficulty in the last point because it doesn't seem clear, at least from what I've read, that that was the purpose behind their reason of raping or gang raping them. Could very well be to satisfy their lust. And the ability allowed them to get to the excess of these girls was on the pretense of detaining them. which I think is something that you alluded to earlier in the introduction as well. Right? The fact that they didn't bring them to any court of law to prosecute them or to prove the fact that they have terrorist involvement.
Well, Your Excellency, with regard to the specific concern that it is unclear what the specific purpose of the SMB soldiers was, we concede that one of the possible purposes could be, as you said, to satisfy their lust. However, jurisprudence of this court indicates that the fact that the rape is carried out to a detainee who is accused of involvement with any kind of anti-state forces has predominantly been sufficient for this court to find that the state agent in question intended to intimidate, demean, and punish the detainee. The fact that this intimidation or punishment may have been a minor or secondary purpose was not fatal to the finding of torture. We've seen this in both the cases of Espinosa Gonzalez in Peru, as well as Rosendo Cantu in Mexico.
And in both those cases, there were no signs that there were actual links and that they wanted to intimidate them or humiliate them.
Well, Your Excellency, in both these cases, the women in question were actually chosen and interrogated based on accusations that they were involved with treasonous activities against the state of Peru and against the state of Mexico. And in these cases, even though it was possible that the purpose of the rape could have been sexual gratification of a sort, the court did say quite expressly the test for torture did not require a finding that the purpose of intimidation or the purpose of punishment had to be the predominant purpose or the only purpose.
So it just has to be a purpose?
Yes, it has to be one of the purposes in question. On the facts of the case, we will also submit that the Quispe's clearly suffered an aggravated and serious extent of psychological trauma at least. Crucially, Your Excellency, every single instance of rape is severe enough to constitute a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute. But in this case specifically, the Quispe's were young girls of 12 and 15. They were vulnerable detainees, completely under the control of those soldiers who were supposed to protect the province from terrorists and uphold the law. They were indigenous persons who may not have understood the language of their attackers, who may not have the resources necessary to recover from such an attack, and they were repeatedly assaulted over the course of 1 month. Your Excellency, it cannot be denied that the Quispe's would have endured the repeated brutalization of their bodies and severe psychological trauma from these repeated assaults. Accordingly, Your Excellency, the petitioners therefore submit that the Quispe's endured torture at the hands of the Nairan soldiers, and Naira therefore violated their Article 5.2 rights. Moving on to Category B, the petitioners submit that the detention of the Quispe's, without allowing them the opportunity to appear before a competent judicial authority, is a violation of a litany of rights, Articles 7.3, 7.5, 8.1, and 8.2, as we've set out in our written memo. But for the purposes of today's proceedings, I will be focusing on the only contentious allegations, the detention of the Quispe's being a violation of their Articles 7.5 and 8.1 rights to trial within a reasonable time. As a preliminary point, we note that both Articles 7.5 and 8.1 protect the same liberties, but differ in their references to what constitutes a reasonable period. Per this court in Jorge Jimenez, this distinction stems from the fact that Article 7.5 applies specifically to accused persons subject to pretrial incarceration. Accordingly, the Article 7.5 measure for a reasonable period therefore imposes a particular obligation on the state to resolve the case on a priority basis and avoid delays compared to Article 8.1. Looking at the law concerning assessing the reasonableness of a length of incarceration without conviction, it is first submitted that any duration of precautionary detention in this case was entirely unnecessary, since it was clear that the Quispe's were not involved in any terrorist activities and therefore would not have hindered any investigation into the Freedom Brigades.
How do you know that it's clear they were not involved?
Well, Your Excellency, we would submit that it was clear that they were not involved based on the fact that the SMB soldiers' behavior indicates that it was unlikely they believed the Quispe's were serious terrorist threats. Firstly, they were 12 and 15-year-old children. They had no known links to the Freedom Brigade. Secondly, empirical evidence does suggest that the overwhelming majority of terrorists tend to be male. And finally, and very significantly, the behavior of the soldiers indicates that they never saw the key space as a significant terrorist threat. From the facts that we are presented, instead of interrogating the sisters, instead what the soldiers did was that they forced them to clean, to do laundry, and to cook for the base. Your Excellency, we would go as far as to say that this behavior is entirely inconsistent with how any law enforcement individual would treat a known terrorist suspect. Our position, therefore, is that the SMB never had any concrete evidence of the alleged link between the Freedom Brigade and the key space, let alone any evidence for a risk that the key space would hinder the investigation in any way or attempt to evade justice.
So even if I follow you that there is a breach, but isn't there the state of emergency powers which allows you to delegate from both these rights?
Your Excellency, we concede that there is a state of emergency power that allows Naira to derogate from these rights. However, even considering the state of emergency, we would submit that the length of the detention in this case, 1 month, was manifestly unnecessary. We would like to point Your Excellency.
1 month is manifestly unnecessary.
Yes, Your Excellency. We would like to point.
Case law.
Yes, we would like to point Your Excellency.
In the context of that regulation, in the state of emergency.
Yes. The European Court of Human Rights has found that even in states of emergencies that threaten the life of a nation, there should not be an interval greater than 7 days between detention and appearance before a judicial authority, as anything longer would impede the essence of the defendant's rights to both free movement and a presumption of innocence. While we concede that there is no inter-American authority that is precisely on point, considering the ECHR does deal with an equivalent right, and human rights by their nature are meant to be universal, we would submit that this should be read into the ECHR as well.
But how do we know that this private group, they were state-sponsored in some extent? But can their actions be attributed to the state of Naira?
Well, Your Excellency, on the facts of the case, we would submit that their actions can be attributed to the state of Naira, considering that they seem to be state agents in that they were soldiers of the state, and they were also appointed by the president of the time to form these units within the province. It is our position, therefore, that the court should find that in light of state practice, 1 month is a manifestly excessive period of detention, especially since there is no clear reason for Naira's delay, considering the key space case does not seem particularly complex. Accordingly, Your Excellency, we submit that Naira has violated the key space rights under Article 7.5 and 8.1 of the ACHR. The detention is therefore illegal and necessarily arbitrary under Article 7.3, and also a violation of their rights to presume innocent under Article 8.2. Moving then to Category C, we submit that forcing the key space to cook, clean, and do laundry in the Wami Special Military Base is a clear breach of their rights to the freedom from slavery under Article 6 of the ACHR. Under Article 27.2, the right to freedom from slavery is so fundamental that it is non-derogable even in an emergency. Per Article 6.2, Your Excellency, no one shall be required to perform forced or compulsory labour, which this court in the case of Ituango massacres has defined as any involuntary work exacted under the menace of penalty. In this case, considering the totality of the circumstances, the key space were detained against their will, and they were frequently sexually assaulted. It is therefore submitted that these soldiers' orders for them to cook, for them to clean, and for them to do laundry were made under the clear threat of further physical and sexual violence. While we would accept that Article 6 acknowledges that 6.2 does not prohibit the imposition of a penalty that includes forced labour on prisoners, 6.3a also expressly states, however, 6.3a states that this reference to forced labour strictly refers to work or service normally required of a person imprisoned in execution of a sentence or a formal decision passed by a competent judicial authority. In the key space case, Your Excellency, considering they had not been sentenced and they had not even seen a competent judicial authority prior to detention, this exception regarding criminal penalties or forced labour cannot apply in this case. Accordingly, Naira is in violation of Article 6.2. Moving then to our second point, Your Excellency, is the petitioner's position that Naira's declaration of a state of emergency in 1990 does not excuse any of the aforementioned violations. Firstly, as previously noted, the sexual abuse and the forced labour of the case base are violations of their non-derogable rights, which, per Article 27.2, cannot be excused even in a state of emergency. With regards to the pre-trial detention of the case base and the violations that stem from this detention, we would further submit that the month-long detention ultimately exceeds Naira's Article 27 liberty to suspend the guarantee of non-derogable rights to the extent strictly required by the exigencies of the situation. While we would acknowledge that the extended detention may be necessary in certain cases concerning terrorist suspects, because the state does have the ability to enact legislation that guarantees its safety from terrorism, this ability must also be balanced with protection of the detainee's human rights. A minimum requirement of such balance, per the ECHR case of Fox, Campbell and Hartley in the UK, is that the state must furnish at least some facts or information capable of satisfying the court that the arrested persons were reasonably suspected of having committed an offence. This is clearly a necessary requirement, considering the alternative would be that the state can exercise its powers and detain any individual at any time without having to provide any justification or evidence. In the Kisbe's case, where the Nairan government has not adduced any evidence or any reasons before the court why the fight against terrorism in Wami, in Kiliki, and Sonoko rendered judicial intervention impracticable for the duration of 1 month, the state of Naira has failed to justify the necessity of this detention. The court should also take into account that this long duration period left the Kisbe's vulnerable not only to arbitrary interference to the right of liberty, but also to forced slavery and torture. Therefore, in this case, Your Excellency, Naira should minimally be required to give this court concrete evidence that may constitute a basis for the detention, or evidence justifying their failure to bring the Kisbe's before the court within a month. Especially, we think that this need to bring evidence before the court is especially crucial, since 26 years have passed since the Kisbe's were detained, and any sensitivity regarding this information should arguably no longer be relevant.
So if this evidence is available, there is no breach.
Well, Your Excellency, if the evidence is available and on the evidence it is reasonable to conclude that the situation at that time was such that it was necessary for the safety of the state and for the safety of the region of Wami from the Freedom Brigades to detain these women, then there is no breach, Your Excellency.
So shouldn't we just adjourn proceedings to get more evidence?
Well, Your Excellency, considering this case was first initiated by, I believe, the interview with when Monica Kisbe, which was the sister who was also detained, spoke to the TV channel GTV in December 2014, which is 3.5 years ago. We would submit that sufficient time has already lapsed since the possibility of bringing this case to the court first occurred versus where we are today. So our submission and our stance is that if there really was evidence justifying this detention, the state would have made it available to this court either in its August 10, 2016 answer to this commission's first report or today. And the fact that they haven't done so indicates that there just isn't this evidence. Your Excellency, I see I am running out of time, so if I may be of no further assistance to this court, I would like to conclude my submissions. Thank you.
I thought you meant to conclude your submissions.
Oh.
So that's the end, right?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
You may want to change the line.
Okay.
Because it suggests that.
Yeah. No, I think I was gonna.
Like, you just end.
Yeah. I should.
That will be the end of my submissions of me, right?
Okay.
So I just keep commenting.
Oh shit, this is still going.
There's no real link between both of It's quite disparate.
My first issue has a link to